All right, good morning, everyone. So as we started last week, we're going to continue looking at how God has chosen to communicate with people. We're still in the Old Testament. Last week we looked at how he talked to Adam and Eve in the garden. And this week we're going to just keep moving right along in Genesis. We're going to look at the patriarchs. Specifically, I want to look at Noah and Abraham this morning. On the off chance that we have the time and get to it, we'll talk a little bit about Isaac and Jacob, but there's a lot of Abraham. Abraham spoke with God, and God spoke with Abraham quite often. A recurring thing that I noticed between Noah and Abraham and others is that God will frequently come back and kind of tell people the same thing, whether that's to just remind them of what he's already promised and what he's already said before, whether that's to reinforce what he expects out of people, or it's just to comfort them. It's kind of depending on the situation, but God will frequently come back and tell these patriarchs, the same thing over and over again, probably because also, they need reminding. So throughout this patriarchal age, God more or less chose the heads of the families, heads of the households, and that's kind of who he chose to speak to, and then it was up to them to, share what was going on with their families, with the people around them. Occasionally, God spoke to these other members of the family, but it was usually when the patriarch was not around or the cause of the problem, which unfortunately, that happens with Abraham a few times with Hagar, where he's half of the problem, so God speaks to Hagar instead. So we're going to start with Noah this morning. After Adam and Eve ate of the fruit, were banished from the garden, it doesn't say that God spoke to them anymore, but God did not give up on humanity. He just kind of changed his method of communication. After Seth was born at the end of Genesis 4, the book says in verse 26, the very end of Genesis chapter 4, at that time people began to call on the name of the Lord. So despite Adam and Eve getting removed from the garden, they did not give up on God. God did not give up on them. Whatever calling on the name of the Lord means, whether that means public worship or enough people had kind of adopted these customs that there was proper religious ceremonies being built up. I'm not sure, but at the very least there's indication that even after getting kicked out of the garden, Adam and Eve did not just let everyone forget about God, or God did not let them forget about him. However, from Genesis 5, it's pretty much the genealogy that draws the line from Adam to Noah. It is, roughly, I wrote it down here, 1,656 years that it spans. So in a couple weeks, when we talk about kind of periods where, the Bible shows that God did not necessarily talk to anyone, at least directly, we'll come back and discuss this a bit more. 1,656 years. That is, a crazy amount of time to get covered in 32 verses. There's so many lives, so many experiences that we just don't have any information about. Genesis 5:21 to 24 does mention Enoch and how he was taken away by God rather than dying first. So it is obvious that people were familiar with God, people worshipped God, people communicated to him. And Enoch at least must have had a strong personal relationship with God. It's just we don't get that full story. Noah is introduced at the very end of Genesis chapter 5, and then he is the central figure for chapters 6 through 9. The first time that God speaks to Noah according to Genesis, is in chapter 6, verse 13, so God said to Noah, I'm going to put an end to all people, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. I am surely going to destroy both them and the earth. So make yourself an ark of cypress wood, make rooms in it, and coat it with pitch inside and out. This is how you are to build it. The ark is to be 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high. Make a roof of it, leaving below the roof an opening 1 cubit high all around. Put a door in the side of the ark and make lower, middle, and upper decks. I am going to bring floodwaters on the earth to destroy all life under the heavens. Every creature that has the breath of life in it, everything on earth will perish. But I will establish my covenant with you, and you will enter the ark, you and your sons and your wife and your sons' wives with you. You are to bring into the ark 2 of all living creatures, male and female, to keep them alive with you. 2 of every kind of bird, of every kind of animal, and of every kind of creature that moves along the ground. Will come to you to be kept alive. You are to take every kind of food that is to be eaten and store it away as food for you and for them. Imagine if that was the very first thing that God told to you. Out of nowhere, Noah was, at least 500 years old. So first off, that's wild. And then second, the Creator God more or less shows up to Noah and just says, hey, all right, just so you know, I'm going to destroy everything except for you and some animals, and you're going to build this giant boat to keep everyone and everything safe. There's no subtlety in that. There's really not. It's just very direct, very simple. God is letting Noah know right up front, here's my plan, here's how you fit in, here's what I expect you to do. Okay, now go do it. And to Noah's credit, at the end of chapter 6, it says he did everything just as God commanded him. So that's good. Chapter 7 is God again giving Noah instructions on what to do in the ark. Genesis chapter 7, starting verse 1. The Lord said to Noah, go into the ark, you and your whole family, because I found you righteous in this generation. Take with you 7 pairs of every kind of clean animal, a male and its mate, and 1 pair of every kind of unclean animal, a male and its mate, and also 7 pairs of every kind of bird, male and female, to keep their various kinds alive throughout the earth. 7 days from now I will send rain on the earth for 40 days and 40 nights, and I will wipe from the face of the earth every living creature I have made. And Noah did all that the Lord commanded him. Something that I didn't even consider to look up until I was reading it just now is why in chapter 6 did God say just take 2 of all living creatures, 2 animals, 2 birds, but then in chapter 7 it's 7 pairs of clean animals and then 1 pair of unclean, 7 pairs of birds. Does anyone have an idea why he would have shifted from 1 pair to 7 pairs? Perfect. This will go in the things for me to look up and bring back next week.
What I've read is it was for sacrifice.
Okay. Like on the boat for sacrifice?
On the boat, yes, for sacrifice.
All right.
Now there are varying commentaries on the 2x2 and the 7 pairs, but the most common agreement is that it was for sacrifice.
Okay.
So for worship still. On the boat.
All right. So if you didn't hear him, Jason just said that the common consensus for commentaries is that it would be for sacrifice and worship while they were on the ark, so they could still worship God the way that they, normally do. All right. So Noah does all that God commands him. He is 600 years old, so this chapter 6 and so far in chapter 7 have covered 100 years of Noah's life, which also is insane to me. But and then God does not actually speak to Noah again until chapter 8 in verses 15 to 17. That's not to say that God, was not involved in what was going on in Noah's life. Not to say that God was neglecting him in any way. They just didn't have, direct communication. So in chapter 8, verses 15 to 17, God tells Noah, "Come out of the ark, you and your wife and your sons and their wives. Bring out every kind of living creature that is with you, the birds, the animals, and all the creatures that move along the ground, so they can multiply on the earth and be fruitful and increase in number on it." And then Noah did. God told him to leave the ark, and, why at this point, why wouldn't he trust God? God has seen him through basically the destruction of the world, so it would make sense that he would trust God now. Noah goes out, and the first thing that he does after he leaves the ark is that he builds an altar. And then he takes some of the clean animals and the birds, and he sacrifices them. So yeah, that would make sense that you'd want, more than one pair if the first thing you're going to do is sacrifice some of them. And then in Genesis 9, it kind of wraps up where God gives even more commands to Noah. He tells Noah and his sons to be fruitful, similar to what he told Adam and Eve in the garden. In verse 3 of chapter 9 is the first time that God tells anyone, yeah, you can go ahead and eat animals, you can eat meat. I just think that's interesting that it took, 1700 years of life existing before people had bacon. And then God also gives Noah a warning in chapter 9, verse 5. "And for your lifeblood I will surely demand an accounting. I will demand an accounting from every animal, and from each human being too I will demand an accounting for the life of another human being." Verse 6. "Whoever sheds human blood, by humans shall their blood be shed. For in the image of God has God made mankind." So, yeah, you get to eat meat, but there will be an accounting that you're not just senselessly killing the animals, and then also you will be held accountable for any humans that you kill. It's a pretty reasonable rule, I think. Don't kill other people. Makes sense to me. And then God goes on to establish the rainbow as a covenant that he'll never again destroy the earth with water. He lets Noah that this is happening and that this is the sign of his promise. And then that's the last thing that God directly tells Noah. Throughout these 3 chapters, it's just simply God tells Noah, all right, here's what I want to do. Here's how you fit in this. Go make it happen. And then, Noah obeys. There's, potentially 100 years of him working on this ark, probably getting ridiculed and made fun of. I imagine more than one night his family is trying to tell him, "You are wasting your time, you're wasting our money, none of this is going to happen, what are you even doing?" But Noah had faith that, God would do what he said he would do. Any thoughts on how God spoke to Noah and how he used Noah to, affect change in the world?
I think it's interesting, Alex, that when they're talking about Noah, it said God was regretful and sorrowful that he had created what he had created. It just, to ever want God to be regretful that he created me, it's just an amazing thought. But I don't want that.
Amazing in
you don't
grand, not amazing as in good.
Right, not amazing as in good, but amazingly bad. That, God could feel that regret and sorrow for his greatest creation. I mean, the thing that he is proudest of, the only thing that he gave salvation to be regretful that he created that.
Jason had mentioned that, in the course of the story with Noah, that it mentioned that God was regretful and sorrowful in what he had created, and just how, you say amazing, I'm going to say terrifying.
Yes.
That thought would be that, that we as a collective could be so bad that God is regretful that he made us. I mean, I don't know. Just thinking of things like Sodom and Gomorrah or this, it's just crazy to think about the idea that people could be so bad that God's decision is just, yeah, let's just get rid of these guys and, in Noah's case, start over. In Sodom and Gomorrah's case, just let it all burn down and call it a day.
Also kind of speaks to God's decision to not do it again after the flood and giving us free thought and free choice to make our own decisions, to make our own mistakes, and to trust that maybe we'll come back and do what's right and be better.
Yeah. That does speak to God's decision to promise to not do it again, and that we always have that free will and that chance, that opportunity to, I guess, make amends, repent of what we've done. You have more?
Yeah, it's also kind of a testament of his love, because if every parent decided to just kind of like cut off their child or kill their child when it shows that they're going down a really terrible path. For example, there was a shooter in Australia and they interviewed the parents, and even though their child had done something terrible, they condemned it, but they still loved their kid. Like, they're gonna take the repercussions and accept the repercussions against their child, but they still love them and hope for a better future after the fact. I think that kind of is a reflection of God's love in this instance as well.
Yeah, Kelly.
I could also might do with Arthur that when he told Noah, now you're responsible. Mankind's responsible for shepherding yourselves. He says, now if somebody kills somebody, you guys are responsible for taking care of it. I'm not going to let it get to the point where I'm not going to do anything about it until it gets so bad that I have to take care of everybody. Now you take care of it now. I think that's part of it. Why I don't have to go farther.
If you didn't hear, Kevin pointed out that this is also kind of in terms of mankind needing to give an account for the blood that we shed. That is kind of God, maybe not shifting responsibility, but kind of shifting responsibility and saying that, all right, you guys have to kind of basically manage yourselves. You need to work out what's going on so that God doesn't have to let it rise all the way to the top and him have to take drastic measures. Any other thoughts on Noah? All right, let's roll right into Abraham, someone that realistically we could spend the rest of the year talking about. So we've got about 30 minutes, so we'll see how we do. When I think of a patriarch, a biblical patriarch, Abraham is the first one who comes to mind. He is, I don't know, the main character, I guess, for quite a bit of this book, whether directly through him or as we talk about, his children and grandchildren and so on. Like, Abraham is so ridiculously impactful. There's just so much going on. The Lord calls him in chapter 12, before his name is Abraham, telling him to, all right, go ahead, pick up all of your stuff. We are moving. You are leaving your family. You are going to go settle in a promised land that I've prepared for you. And God says, I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you. I'll make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples on the earth will be blessed through you. So Abram listened to God. He packed up all of his stuff. He took his nephew Lot with him, and they headed out. And he was 75 years old. A good 400-something years younger than Noah was. So comparatively, Abram's a spry young guy, but I don't think I would be willing to get up and move, especially walking at 75. But, that is kind of just a testament to Abram's faith from the very beginning, that he's going to listen to what God says, who again speaks to him directly, and move on. God speaks to Abram again in verse 7 of Genesis chapter 12, more or less to encourage him to keep going and keep working. The Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your offspring I'll give this land. He kind of shows up and just reminds Abram, look, we are doing this, you have a purpose for this. So Abram stopped and built an altar, because he probably felt particularly convicted if God's going to stop in and encourage him, and he's going to worship God there. He also builds an altar in verse 6. So as he travels, he keeps stopping and putting up altars. And then again in verse 8, he travels a little bit further. He stops, he builds an altar, he worships God as he goes along. In Genesis 12, verses 10 to 19, describe when Abram stops in Egypt to live for a while, and this is the first time that he lies about his wife just being his sister. Which, if I'm being honest, both of these instances, from a storytelling perspective, they disappoint me a lot, because Abram makes it out of this situation, with God's help, significantly better off than he was before. In this case, Pharaoh eventually, to make sure that God doesn't punish him, ends up giving Abram so much wealth, so many cattle, slaves. Financially, Abram is so much better off here than he was. But Abram makes a poor decision, and God, while not directly telling Abram what's happening, intervenes, and Pharaoh figures out what's going on. In chapter 13 of Genesis, Abram and Lot decide to separate their flocks because, they just came into essentially a lot of money, so now they have way too much going on, and they need to spread out so that they can both thrive and continue to grow. After they do that, God again speaks to Abram about the land that he's promised. And what does Abram do after he talks to God, or God talks to him? He builds another altar so that he can worship God and, reaffirm his faith. It just seems that each time that God reaffirms his promise and stops and reminds Abram, there is a promised land for you. I'm doing this for you. You're going to be so incredibly blessed. After he gets told that, Abram doubles down and he builds an altar so that he can pray to God, so that he can immediately affirm that he has that faith in God, that he has that trust, that he is, a good servant, essentially. Abram has definitely gone through a lot more in his life at this point than I have, or probably ever will. I'm going to put my foot in my mouth, but I don't imagine I will ever go to Egypt and have their political leaders look at Olivia and say, "You're mine now." If that did happen, I would like to have the courage to not say, "Oh, that's my sister, that's fine."
I'd like to see you try.
See, Olivia won't let it happen, so we're all fine anyway.
But it wasn't a lie. Sarah was his sister.
It wasn't.
His half-sister.
Yeah, Sarah was his half-sister, but it wasn't really the truth.
That's a good point. Is that half truth a lie?
I would say that a half-truth is a lie,
I
yeah.
agree with you, a half-truth is a lie, especially when my kids tell it.
But yes, you're right. There is, just a little bit of truth in there. As we talked about last week with the serpent, there was just enough truth in there that it was believable. So now Abram's kind of falling in that same trap. Anyway, as I was saying, I can't imagine all the things that Abram has gone through. I can't imagine the consistent faith, but I could assume that getting periodic, personalized, direct feedback and encouragement would probably help. If you were told to do something by God and as you're traveling along, you keep getting told this is what you're supposed to be doing, this is the right thing, very directly, very clearly, I would be inclined to believe it, I think. I think things kind of get interesting in Genesis chapter 15. The chapter opens with God speaking to Abram in a vision. So whether that's a dream or just, as he's walking, he has this epiphany, I'm not sure. But the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your very great reward. And then Abram goes on to kind of have a full-on conversation with God about what's going on, trying to, figure out the details of this promise. Abram said, Sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless? And the one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus. And Abram said, You've given me no children, so a servant in my household will be my heir. Then the word of the Lord came to him, This man will not be your heir, but a son who is your own flesh and blood will be your heir. He took him outside and said, Look up at the sky and count the stars, if indeed you can count them. Then he said to him, So shall your offspring be. Abram believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. He also said to him, I am the Lord, who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans, to give you this land to take possession of it. But Abram said, Sovereign Lord, how can I know that I will gain possession of it? So the Lord said to him, Bring me a heifer, a goat, and a ram, each 3 years old, along with a dove and a young pigeon. Then Abraham brought all these to him, cut them in two, and arranged the halves opposite each other. The birds, however, he did not cut in half. Then birds of prey came down on the carcasses, but Abram drove them away. As the sun was setting, Abram fell into a deep sleep, and a thick and dreadful darkness came over him. Then the Lord said to him, Know for certain that for 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, that they will be enslaved and mistreated there. But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterward they will come out with great possessions. You, however, will go to your ancestors in peace and be buried at a good old age. In the 4th generation your descendants will come back here, for the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached the full measure. When the sun had set and darkness had fallen, a smoking fire pot with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. On that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram and said, To your descendants I give this land, from the Wadi of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates, the land of the Kenites, Kizites, Cadmonites, Hittites, Perizzites, Rephaites, Amorites, Canaanites, Girgashites, and Jebusites. So all that to say that Abram had the opportunity to have like a genuine back and forth conversation with God, where he got to ask questions. He wasn't necessarily answered directly, but God again proved his promise by a measure and show of his power. God tells Abram, hey, look, your people are going to be, displaced from their country for about 400 years, which is, as we know, a warning of what's going on that brings up Moses. The Israelites were there in Egypt for about 400 years. I don't know, kind of jealous of the idea that some of these people get to actually speak to God and hear a definitive reply back. I can just imagine that would be like sending an email out to the CEO of a company and them responding to you and it not just getting filtered out. I would love it if you could say, hey boss, I have a quick question about this, and actually getting them to respond. I don't know, maybe I'm not important enough for that. But chapter 15 ends with God again reaffirming with Abram that there is a promised land and that he is going to make it there, that his people are going to live there. I don't know, it just seems that every so often God is circling back and reaffirming, reassuring, re-promising. That's what's going on. Chapter 16 takes kind of a detour away from Abram so that we can hear about Hagar and all that she gets put through, the awkward position of being Sarah's slave, and then also the mother of Abram's child. Another poor judgment point from humanity there. But as she's worried about what's going on, an angel of the Lord does show up to give her direct comfort, to give her direct instruction. And in verses 11 through 12 of chapter 16, the angel of the Lord said to her, "You are now pregnant. You will give birth to a son. You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard your misery. He will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he will live in hostility toward all his brothers." I'm not sure that that's supposed to be comforting. It is at the very least, I think, a fair warning. It kind of brings up the question, was Hagar told this because God just knew what was going to happen because he understands people's hearts? Or is this something that, because God said it, that's what made it happen? And, you can get into free will versus predestination. I'm going to take the approach that it is God just knows people's hearts and knows how things are going to turn out from omniscience, not a matter of him setting Ishmael on a certain path and kind of forcing things to happen.
God is telling her that even though she's a servant, your son won't be. Your son's going to be a free man. That
is a good point, Kevin. God is letting her know that even though you are a servant, your son won't be. Your son will be a free man, or a wild donkey of a man. Yeah, I guess that there is a comfort in that he will be free and able to make his own choices in life and do what he wants. And then chapter 17 veers right back into Abram. God reestablishes his covenant again, changes Abram's name to Abraham, institutes circumcision as a sign of this covenant. And throughout the chapter, they again talk back and forth. God tells Abraham what's going on. Abraham gets to respond and ask questions, and they get to talk. They have, a genuine relationship with one another. And then chapter 18 has a fun shift in the way that God communicates with Abraham. Rather than just, speaking from the heavens or appearing in a vision, God and two angels show up. Like, they take on a human-like form, and they walk right up to Abraham's camp, and Abraham entertains them as guests, which, after he figured out what was going on, I can only imagine that Abraham's heart was probably racing, probably replayed every single thing he said to make sure that he didn't, lie, say something off, trip over his words, what have you. I don't know. I do not know how I would react. Certainly not if God showed up in the flesh to talk, other than terrified. Let's see. Also, one of my favorite parts of this whole story is in Genesis 18, verses 13 and 14. After they're talking, God, again in person, is telling Abraham, look, by this time next year, you're going to have a son. It'll be with Sarah. This will be this child that I promised you. And Sarah is standing just outside the entrance of the tent, and she's eavesdropping, and she laughs at what's going on, because at this point she's, like 90? Somewhere around there, I think. So definitely very past the age of having children. So she laughs at herself and says in verse 12, after I'm worn out and my Lord is old, will I now have this pleasure? Then the Lord said to Abraham, again, in person, why did Sarah laugh and say, will I really have a child now that I'm old? Is anything too hard for the Lord? I will return to you at the appointed time next year, and Sarah will have a son. Sarah was afraid, so she lied and said, I did not laugh. But he said, yes, you did laugh. Imagine, not only does God visit you in person, but you're going to laugh at what he says and then lie about it to his face. I don't know if that's brave or just stupid. Probably very nervous on Sarah's part, I would imagine. And then, after that happens, as God and the two angels that are with him, they get up to leave, and Abraham's going to basically start begging to God, again, as they're just walking down the road, about Sodom and Gomorrah. As has been mentioned many times over, Abraham's really just worried about his nephew Lot, and he's trying to make sure that he can, save his family. I don't know, just these whole last few chapters related to Abraham are just crazy to me. Just the idea of God showing up in person, sitting down and cooking him food, and then as you walk, just going side by side and saying, okay, what if I can find 100 people? Okay, what if I can find 50 people? What if I can find 20? What if I can find 10? And just keep bargaining down with, the singular being who has the power to do anything, thinking that realistically that Abraham's concerns get to make any difference, that God's not going to do what he wants anyway. And then God is just, I can only imagine walking, a few steps in front of him, just going, yep, yeah, if you find 20, great. Yep, if you find 10, sure. Because he already knows. He knows exactly how many righteous people that Abraham would be able to find.
He also probably knew that he was going to try bargaining.
Yeah.
He knew his heart, and I wonder if God's closeness and proximity to humans and the way that he shifted back to be further away from people has influenced the way that humans associate communication with him, because it seems like they were very close back in the day, but now it's more like a respect thing. Maybe I feel like they were bargaining with them from a child to their father instead of revering him as a god.
Yeah, Livy was pointing out that this physical proximity and closeness versus when we more or less have prayer as a means of communicating with God, that might have changed kind of the dynamic feelings of a child trying to bargain with their parent or their father versus revering God as a god. I don't know. People, I imagine, have fervent prayer to God where they try to bargain and ask for things all the time. It's just that they don't get to do it in person.
Culture changes.
Culture does change. But also you have to think that, this is God talking to Abraham a lot, but there's thousands of other people that are alive at this same time that, as far as we know, God didn't talk to them. God had this special relationship with Abraham. It was up to Abraham to let his family know what was going on. And then, everyone else just had to trust that Abraham was telling the truth, essentially. The end of chapter 18, verse 32, Abraham's still bargaining. He says, "May the Lord not be angry, but let me speak just once more. What if only 10 can be found there?" He answered, "For the sake of 10, I'll not destroy it." When the Lord had finished speaking with Abraham, he left, and Abraham returned home. So after they're done talking, God just leaves. I mean, does he walk off? Does he disappear? Does he physically ascend? We have no idea. But when God was done talking, when he finished saying all that he needed to say, he didn't really give Abraham a chance to try to, keep going. God's word was final, and then that was it. Chapter 19 discusses Sodom and Gomorrah getting destroyed, the issue with Lot and his daughters. Bobby covered it in a sermon. Was it last week? Last week, yeah. Sorry, my days are all running together. But yeah, so Bobby covered that in a sermon last week. If you missed it, it's uploaded on our YouTube channel. So you can go back and watch it. All right, about 5 minutes left. Chapter 20 has Abraham again moving through, and he lies about his relationship with Sarah. Again, I guess I just don't like, from a storytelling perspective, that he gets away with it twice. He gets away with it once. All right, it happens, but man, it happens twice. I can't stand it. In this instance, God directly speaks to the other king, Abimelech, and says, "Hey, you are trying to be with this woman, Sarah. She's married." And Abimelech rightfully tells God, "Yeah, I didn't know that. He didn't tell me that." So Abimelech essentially gets to say, "This isn't my fault. Please don't punish me." And God, to his credit, says, "You're right. It's not your fault. Just don't do anything." And then Abimelech gives Sarah back. Abimelech gives Abraham more cattle and sheep and more slaves and 1,000 pieces of silver. Like, Abraham just gets enriched because he keeps lying about his wife. I don't know, as Bobby mentioned a few weeks ago, Abraham's willing to literally go wage war for his nephew to rescue him. But as soon as someone remotely powerful expresses interest in Sarah, he rolls over and basically says, "Here you go." I don't understand how he wouldn't care about his wife more. But Isaac gets born as promised in chapter 21. Chapter 22 has, when Abraham is tested by God to sacrifice Isaac, God and Abraham, again, are directly communicating back and forth, like having full-on conversations. In chapter 22, it mentions that the angel of the Lord spoke to Abraham in verses 11 and 15. It says that the angel of the Lord spoke from heaven. So in this instance, an angel did not come down to earth to talk in person, but rather Abraham would have just heard this voice from the heavens. So those are, just a couple of the patriarchs. We're still in a point where God is speaking very directly to people, having that relationship where the people that he speaks to are able to ask him questions and express their concerns and frustrations. In both Noah and Abraham's case, it's just a testament that faith in God can do incredible, incredible things, whether that's surviving the destruction of the world or establishing an entire lineage that eventually brings about the Messiah. I mean, the faith that these two men have just is really, impactful. Good things to emulate. There's so much more that we could say about Noah and Abraham. There's so much that we could say about other patriarchs. But in the interest of finishing everything up, we are going to move on next week. I'm going to talk about some prophets and how God is starting to shift his communication that way. We're going to look at Moses. We're going to look at Jonah. We're going to look at Isaiah. Thank you.